Hello, YouTubers, and welcome to Level-Headed News. This is your host, Brenda. I've got another article here that I thought would make a good single article episode for you. The URL is in the description of the video if you want to take a look at it. It is off of Less Government is the Best Government, and it is entitled Bounty and the Beast. And it was written by Scott Rohter, and that's R-O-H-T-E-R. And it's from January, and it says, all the bounty of God's earthly blessings come from the land. This includes our health and our wealth. But in the United States, about half of the land west of the Rocky Mountains is owned and controlled by the federal government. 49% of the land west of the Rocky Mountains, including Alaska, is controlled by Congress from Washington, D.C. This is the beauty in my analogy of Bounty and the Beast. I'm going to blow this up just a little bit bigger here, if I can get everything to cooperate with me here. There we go. The older I get, the finer the print seems to get. The actual percentage of state land owned by the federal government varies in each western state, from a high of almost 90% in Nevada to a low of just under 30% in Montana. The combined average in all 12 western states is just under 50%, compared to about 3% in states which are east of the Rocky Mountains. The 12 western states, along with the amounts of land owned by the federal government, are Washington, 35%, Oregon, 53%, California, 45%, Idaho, 50%, Nevada, 85%, Montana, 30%, Wyoming, 42%, Colorado, 37%, Utah, 57%, Arizona, 48%, New Mexico, 41%, and Alaska at 69%. Each of the Rocky Mountains, east of the Rocky Mountains, the percentage of land controlled by the federal government is much less than you can see by this map. If you click on the link there for the map, it'll show you. It says, why is there such a huge disparity in the amount of land controlled by Congress east of the Mississippi River and west of the Rocky Mountains? By what legal stretch of the imagination and unconstitutional misappropriation of congressional authority did the United States government wind up in control of so much of the land in the West? The disparity clearly violates the equal footing principle by which all new states are supposed to be admitted to the Union on the same basis as all the previous states. So how did Western states lose control over nearly half the land within their borders? We're not talking about a meager amount of land. We're talking about over 700 million acres, almost 1/3 of all the land in the United States of America. All of this land is administered by Congress and controlled from Washington, D.C., and the overwhelmingly majority of this land is located west of the Rocky Mountains. So just how did this happen? When the Western states applied to be admitted into the Union, Congress required them through various enabling acts, which passed to relinquish control over this land. It was a quid pro quo. Even more amazing than this constitutional overreach is the fact that all 12 Western states agreed to go along with this plan. The Constitution limits the amount of land which the federal government can own and control to just 10 square miles, 100 square miles. The District of Columbia, plus small amounts of land to be used for the construction of forts and ports, post offices, and other needful buildings. This part of the Constitution is known as the Enclave Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. Since all of the powers that belong to the federal government are enumerated in the Constitution, and since it has no other powers which are not enumerated in the Constitution according to the 9th and 10th Amendments, and since It does not say anywhere else in the Constitution that the United States government can control such large amounts of land as it currently does and use for whatever purpose it wants. It is perfectly reasonable to conclude that this is not permitted to do it. The United States Constitution does not give the federal government unlimited authority to control nearly half the land in our 12 western states. There is only so much land that the federal government can legitimately designate as national parks or wilderness areas under the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. During the 19th century, the federal government transferred title to 2 millions, or I'm sorry, try that again, transferred title to millions of acres of land east of the Mississippi River to include farmers and ranchers through land grants of 160 acres. This same policy was tried west of the Rocky Mountains, but various different reasons it was abandoned. When settlers began homesteading land in the West, it soon became obvious that 160 acres was just not enough land to support a viable farm. In many areas of the West, there was not enough timber to build a house. The weather was unpredictable and rain and water were unreliable. In some places, there just wasn't any water. There were many reasons that homesteading western land proved to be much harder than it was east of the Mississippi River Valley, and the original Homestead Act of 1876 did not make any allowances for such things. It was 160 acres or nothing, and if you didn't comply with the terms of the land grant, then you lost your claim to ownership of the land. Eventually, the federal government pursued a strategy of retaining control over most of the land west of the Rocky Mountains. This was one of the first signs that something was running amok with our federal government in Washington, D.C. The balance of power between the states and the central government had shifted in favor of Washington, D.C. During the last half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, land grants to homesteaders began to be harder and harder to obtain. Unless you were willing to settle in Alaska, there were few and far between. Then in 1976, all homesteading came to an abrupt halt when the Homestead Act was repealed. As land grants were being phased out, they were being issued primarily to railroad companies as an incentive to build the railroads, which would eventually connect the East and the West coasts. They were issued to miners to prospect for gold and other precious materials or minerals, but because of the difficulties in homesteading in the West, land grants were no longer being routinely issued to farmers and ranchers. Western pioneers were encouraged to settle in pre-existing communities that were springing up along the railroad lines. These were the first tenuous steps of the federal government into urban planning. From this rather timid beginning, the federal government's land management policies have only become progressively worse and more restrictive over time. The Taylor Grazing Act was enacted by Congress in 1934 to manage western grasslands. Then, along with repeal of the Homestead Act in 1976, Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. It was signed into law by President Gerald Ford, formally codify into law the government's new policy of retaining control over all remaining public lands. You don't have to wonder how this get my tongue to work, metamorphosis happened. 200 years had passed since the Constitution was signed and the federal government had been created, and as it became more powerful over the years with the passage of the 16th Amendment and the creation of the federal income tax, Washington began to assert its newfound power in ways and in areas where it had no constitutional authority to do so. And so it began to exert its newfound leverage over the new states as they were admitted to the Union. Starting with Nevada, Congress pressured newly recognized states to sign what amounted to a quitclaim deed to huge amounts of land within their borders in order to gain admittance to the Union. Under an 1864 Act of Congress, which recognized the state of Nevada, Congress stipulated in their third paragraph of Section 4 that Nevada agreed to give up control of what amounted to almost 90% of the land within its sovereign borders. Under the Enabling Act of 1910, New Mexico and Arizona were both forced to relinquish control of approximately 45% of their land within their borders. The same thing happened to every Western state as they were admitted into the Union. The price of admission was the loss of control over much of the land within their borders. It was, and still is, unconstitutional. The federal government has no constitutional authority to control such vast amounts of land. In 1908, Teddy Roosevelt, who was one of America's biggest promoters of big government, signed into law the congressional legislation which created the 90,000-acre Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Oregon. Does that sound familiar to anybody? The bird refuge has since doubled in size to over 180,000 acres through various government land grabs and forced buyouts of private landowners. Dwight and Stephen Hammond of Burns, Oregon, are two of the last remaining private landowners in Harney County, Steens Mountain Wilderness area, which explains why the Bureau of Land Management has been waging a relentless campaign of intimidation and persecution against them. That is why the federal government obtained a first right of refusal on the Hammond property if they ever decide to sell it. And the government has been doing just about everything in its power to force them to sell it, too, including throw them in jail for 5 years. When Republicans praise Teddy Roosevelt, they should never forget that he was one of the biggest proponents of big government. About half of the people left in the town of Burns, Oregon, are now employed by the federal government, since most of the private ranchers, loggers, and miners who used to live there have long since been driven out of business by excessive government regulations. About the only thing left to do in Harney County is to work for a government agency and watch the birds fly overhead. Which brings me to my next point. Some of the biggest supporters of federal land policy in the West are the environmentalists who live hundreds of miles away in big cities like Portland, far removed from the realities of rural life. They're the ones who keep insisting that the public land should be maintained and administered by the federal government for the good of everyone. What they really mean is that they want public land to be kept as a private park so that just they can come out there once a year or on a weekend and enjoy the scenery. There is no constitutional basis for their claim that the federal government can control such vast amounts of territory. The Property Rights Clause in the U.S. Constitution says that the Congress shall have the power to dispose of property and territory belonging to the United States. It does not say that Congress has the power to keep it forever. The latest government attempts to force the Hammond family to sell their ranch now includes additional jail terms of 5 years apiece for Dwight and Stephen Hammond of Burns, Oregon, plus $400,000 in fines for setting several small backfires on their property in 2001 to burn weeds, and again in 2006 to protect their house from a wildfire that was raging nearby. At least one of the backfires, incidentally, spread onto adjacent land they were leasing from the government. The Hammonds were convicted of federal arson charges, and they were sentenced under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. They are currently serving their second jail term in a California federal penitentiary thousands of miles away from all their friends and family. The second jail term after they served their original sentences and were released from prison is really no different than double jeopardy. The Department of Justice has violated the Hammond's Fifth Amendment right. The Fifth Amendment states that no person shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. The same federal government which charged Dwight and Stephen Hammond with arson under an anti-terrorism law also retains control over 700 million acres of Western land that it has no constitutional authority to own. It is time to put the federal government back in its constitutional cage, which America's founding fathers have prepared for it. The federal government needs to begin divesting itself of most of the land it administers in the western states. It has been acquiring this land ever since the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804. This land is being held in clear violation of the United States Constitution. Prior to 1804, the United States obtained a huge chunk of territory from the French through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Vast additional amounts of land were added later after the annexation of Texas in 1845. After the treaty with England in 1846, by which we obtained the Oregon Territory in the Pacific Northwest, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ended the Mexican-American War, by which we obtained most of the southwest United States. And again, after the Gadsden Purchase, in which we purchased some additional land from Mexico in 1853 to adjust the boundary line between Mexico, California, and Arizona. The United States also purchased Alaska in 1867 from Russia. However, there exists no constitutional authority for the federal government to continue to retain control over these lands forever. In order to determine what land rightfully belongs to the federal government, you have to refer to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. There it specifically states that the only land that rightfully belongs to the United States government is a 10 square mile area, which was designated as the District of Columbia, and which became the seat of federal government, plus small additional amounts of land on which to build forts and ports and post offices. Any other land which the federal government currently owns is unconstitutional. There is no basis in the Constitution for the federal government to own 700 million acres of land. There is only so much land that the federal government can claim under the General Welfare Clause. It says, if you enjoyed this article, please share it with others. And I would encourage you to share this with everybody, this video, so that they can understand a little bit more about the land ownership and the land rights and what is going on with federal government and why we are fighting so hard for our Constitution to get this straightened out and keep these ranchers in business, and stop the federal government from selling our mineral rights on our lands to foreign entities. If you like what I'm doing here, give it a thumbs up and share it on your social media so everybody gets to hear the news. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and that way you'll stay informed. See you in the next one.